The Orioles picked up a couple of wins on deadline day on Tuesday. One for beating the Blue Jays, and the other one for upgrading their roster at the deadline. I'll break down the win and all the moves made coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, July 31st, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to recap the Orioles' 6-2 victory over the Blue Jays on Tuesday night. Get you the 5 things you need to know from that one, including another great Corbin Burnes start and the Orioles offense getting it done once again. And then we'll talk about the bevy, the flurry of moves the Orioles made on deadline day. We won't get into Trevor Rogers. Did a full episode, actually a live pod on Tuesday talking about Trevor Rogers. That should be in your feed. Make sure to check that one out. But then right before the deadline, right before 6 o'clock, the O's made a whole bunch of other moves that are interesting to talk about. And then they made some interesting roster moves too, including the top prospect in baseball headed back to Baltimore today. And I'll break it all down coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedonmlb and use the code all lowercase lockedonmlb for a first deposit match up to $100. So we'll get to that crazy deadline in just a moment. But first, we got to talk about an Orioles victory. Final score from Oriole Park at Camden Yards on Tuesday night. The Orioles 6 and the Toronto Blue Jays 2, as the O's, after splitting the doubleheader Monday, have now won 2 of 3. They will finish off the 4-game set with a day game here on Wednesday. But the O's with the win, they get back to 20 games over. They are 64-44 on the season. And as I'm recording right now, it is Yankees 5, Phillies 4 in the 9th inning in Philadelphia. Austin Hayes, our former buddy, hit his first Phillies homer. It was a 3-run shot off the Yankees playing double agent. Then, unfortunately, the Phillies bullpen, which has traded 2 relievers to the Orioles in the last week, blew up, gave up another home run to Jazz Chisholm, which gave the Yankees the lead in the 7th. Monitoring currently if the Phillies can make a 9th inning comeback. So the O's will either still command a half-game lead or it'll go to a game and a half above the Yankees. But either way, going to get you the 5 things you need to know from the Orioles 6-2 win over the Blue Jays. And the first thing you need to know is Corbin Burnes is just, he's so freaking good. Like, he wasn't even at his best. He gave the Orioles 6 2/3 innings on Tuesday night. It was 2 runs, 4 hits, 7 Ks, 3 walks, no home runs, 99 pitches. Now, the Blue Jays had only 3 hard hit balls against him in 6 2/3 innings. They were not squaring him up pretty much at all. But I think he would be upset with his command. 3 walks Burnes doesn't like. And Burnes came into this start. He had not hit a batter all season. Corbin Burnes hit 2 batters in this game on Tuesday. So that combines for 5 free passes. He's going to like the 7 strikeouts. He's going to like pitching into the 7th. He's not going to like the fact that, he got a chance to finish off the 7th and he walked George Springer on 4 pitches, ended up being his final batter. But otherwise, the cutter in the strike zone, the slider was playing well. He was kind of struggling with the command of that sinker. I think the sinker is the pitch he hit both of the batters with, hit 2 righties because that sinker was just running too far to the arm side. But he threw 1 sinker at 99.8 miles an hour, one of the hardest pitches of Burnes' career. And it wasn't the cutter, it was the sinker. So just something to watch as he kind of bumped up the velocity. But yeah, overall, just not his best stuff and still giving you 6 2/3 innings of super strong baseball. The Orioles are, once again, I say it every time he pitches, they are lucky to have him, and he continues to show that. Second thing you need to know from the Orioles win is that Ramon Urias absolutely had a day out of the 9 spot. And it was, among some roster shuffling, he keeps his roster spot. Jackson Holliday's coming up, it looks like. We'll get to that. And most likely, Urias will continue to have his roster spot. And here in the month of July, he is showing why he deserves it at this point. Urias in July now hitting .326 after he goes 3 for 4 in this game, including an opposite field home run in the 3rd, including an RBI single in the 5th, just his second 3-hit game of the season. His OPS is now up to 700. Again, He's been, I know it's only 52 plate appearances in July. It's not like he's been playing every day, but he's been great at the plate when getting those chances. And the O's don't have to choose between him and Mateo right now because Mateo's on the injured list and looks like he'll be out for a while with that dislocated elbow. But Arias, I think, is confirming recently, and although his defense hasn't been to that 2022 Gold Glove level, he's confirming recently, I think, that he's okay with this utility infielder bench role on this team, and he's going to keep it for longer if he keeps hitting. I mean, it's just like that. If they can pop him in there and he can give him a couple base hits, that's going to be huge for this offense as he continues in his roster spot. Now we go from 9 to 1. The third thing you need to know is Colton Cowser seems to like the leadoff spot. Fourth consecutive game in the leadoff spot for Cowser as Brandon Hyde made a little bit of a lineup adjustment on Sunday, and so far it's worked. The O's offense have been good. They've been 3-1 in the 4 games since that shift, and I think Cowser likes it. He's 6 for 17 in the leadoff spot over the last 4 games, hitting over 300 in the month of July as he's really turned his season back around the other way, continues to make hard contact, playing a really good left field when he's out there and center as well. I don't know if this is going to be the lineup all year. I think we could see Gunnar back in that leadoff spot. I think we could see a little bit of Adley Rutschman in that leadoff spot. His bat is starting to swing around in the positive direction finally over these last couple of games. He had a knock and a few hard hit balls on Tuesday, but it's nice to know that Cowser gives you another option to hit leadoff, and so far so good when he's been put in that role. Fourth thing you need to know from the O's win over the Jays Tuesday night is that it was really another good day of good approaches all around by the Orioles offense. The offense is starting to pick it up once again recently. They had the big 3-run inning in the third, and it looked like it was going to kind of be a disaster inning. After Arias hit the solo home run to lead off the inning, the Orioles loaded the bases with nobody out against Chris Bassett. They brought Anthony Santander, their hottest hitter, to the plate, and you're like, oh boy, this could get out of hand. And then on the first pitch, Santander grounds into a 1-2-3 double play on a grounder back to the pitcher. Run doesn't score. They get 2 outs. You're like, oh boy, here we go again. And then Ryan O'Hearn comes up and bloops a 2-run single into left field and makes it all okay because they still get the 2 runs out of the rally. And that's more of what they've been doing. They were really able to limit the strikeouts again, which was great. Only 6 strikeouts compared to 5 walks in this game, which is awesome. They're being more patient. They're drawing more walks at the plate. That's been fantastic to see. And they still got a couple of homers. The one from Arias, also Anthony Santander, hit his team-leading home run number 31 with a solo shot in the 5th inning. So they're kind of putting together over the last couple of days these much more complete offensive performances, the ones we were used to seeing earlier in the year when the O's were hands down the best offense in Major League Baseball. I kept saying it. We knew it was going to come back around. These hitters are too talented for it not to happen. And I think it's showing up again at the right time as the Yankees are kind of finally putting pressure on the Orioles once again. And the fifth and final thing you need to know from the Orioles 6-2 win over the Blue Jays on Tuesday night is that the bullpen just came in and kind of locked it down. There was a little bit of a tricky moment when Burns came out. He left the game, first and second, 2 outs, Orioles leading 6-1. Cionel Perez comes in to face the lefty Dalton Varsho. And on the first pitch, Varsho doubles into the corner, RBI double, makes it 6-2, and puts runners on second and third, and Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is coming to the plate. And the O's had a really tough decision because they basically hadn't gotten Vladdy out the entire series. And you say, first base is open with 2 outs, put him on. But remember, it's a 4-run game. If you put Vladdy on, and even though Cionel Perez just really doesn't give up home runs, if you put Vladdy on, you bring up the next hitter representing the tying run. And you never really want to walk a guy to bring up the tying run, even though it was a lefty on deck for the Blue Jays. The Orioles took a bit of a risk. They pitched to Vladdy, and Perez pitched him well, got him to ground out to get out of the jam, keep it 6-2. And then Perez and Cano combined for a really easy 8th. And how about Sir Anthony Dominguez? 1-2-3. He was nasty with 2 strikeouts in the 9th. Wasn't a save situation because the O's were up 4, but he's given the Orioles 3 scoreless innings out of the from the Phillies on Friday. Looked good again, and the O's locked down a 6-2 win over the Jays on Tuesday. But the win itself was pretty straightforward on Tuesday. The trade deadline for the O's, however, was anything but. It was wild as it got down to the deadline. I will try my best over the final 2 segments of this episode to break down every trade, every move, every roster, everything that the Orioles did or announced on Tuesday. And we'll start that process coming up next. But first, This episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Prize Picks. For me, the most fun and exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. How do you play it? Well, all you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. You can now even win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. Now you can watch Team USA racking up all these medals this summer, put together a lineup of players across sports, basketball, soccer, tennis, golf, and more. You can do it in like 60 seconds, and then you can win money. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. That's code LOCKEDONMLB on Prize Picks for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. So the Orioles won the game over the Blue Jays on Tuesday, but right before that, they were in an absolute trade deadline frenzy. It was pretty crazy. Now, the Orioles made their first move much earlier in the day, or their first move of the deadline, I should say. Obviously, they acquired Zach Eflin and Sir Anthony Dominguez on Friday ahead of the deadline. But their first deadline day move came earlier in the day, and they went and got Trevor Rogers, left-handed starter from the Marlins, sent Connor Norby and Kyle Stowers over to Miami in that deal. For a full breakdown of that trade, I did a live episode in the evening on Tuesday where I broke that trade down in full. So that would be the previous episode before this one in your feed. Make sure to go check that one out. I also live reacted on that show, though, to all the other moves that were pouring in. And that's what we're going to get to on this episode. A further look at all of those other moves that were pouring in on Tuesday. So let's start with the first one we got. This one came about 10 minutes before the 6 o'clock deadline on Tuesday and was fairly surprising because it was a right-handed hitting outfield bat, which we knew the Orioles were looking at. Now, they had gotten one in Christian Pache in the Dominguez for Hayes trade with the Phillies on Friday, but Pache not much of a hitter, so you knew they were still looking for one who could hit a little bit more. And that guy was Eloy Jiménez. That's right. Eloy Jiménez is a Baltimore Oriole. The 27-year-old, well, actually, he'll be later this year, he'll be 28, but 27-year-old right-handed hitting kind of DH/outfielder from the Chicago White Sox. The Orioles sent left-handed pitching prospect out of AAA Trey Mago over to Chicago, also agreed to pay the rest of his contract this year. It's only about $7 million in the deal. Now, Jimenez, first of all, if he hits well, and that's a big if right now with how his season's been going, but if he hits well, the Orioles can bring him back for a couple more years. Now, he signed a pretty team-friendly extension back in starting of the 2019 season. It ran through this year, but it also has 2 years of team options. So he has a $16.5 million team option for 2025 and an $18.5 million team option for 2026. So if he plays well, the O's can bring him back for at least 1 year and maybe even 2 more, but he'd have to play fairly well for the O's to commit $16 to $18 million to Eloy Jiménez. Otherwise, he is not the Eloy Jiménez we maybe remember from the past. He is not the Eloy Jiménez who came up in 2019 at age 22 with the White Sox and hit 31 home runs in 122 games. He's not the Eloy Jiménez who had a 138 WRC plus in the shortened 2020 season, or the 2022 Eloy Jiménez who hit 295, slugged 500, and had a 143 WRC plus that season. Not exactly the same player. Not even the guy who was a little bit above league average last year at the plate. He's the guy now who has certainly had some injuries and is just not having a good offensive season with the White Sox. He's played in only 65 games this year because he's had 2 different stints on the injured list. He had an adductor strain in April. He had a hamstring strain in May. And when he's been out there, really since then, it hasn't been great. 249 plate appearances this year for the White Sox. Eloy Jiménez has just an 80 WRC plus. He's hitting just 240 with a 297 on base and a 345 slugging, just 5 home runs. Now, a 7% walk rate is a little higher than we're used to from Jiménez, and an 18.9% strikeout rate is actually the lowest K rate of his career. So that's a good sign. He's chasing less, he's swinging and missing less, but he's hitting for far less power. Again, that slugging percentage, very much a career low at 345, almost 100 points lower than his second lowest, a 105 isolated power. He's just not driving the baseball in the air. So you're asking, okay, how does he go from at least at worst a slightly above league average hitter to a guy who's 20% worse than league average with the bat, despite the fact that when you look at his baseball savant page, like things look pretty good. Average exit velocity of 92.4 miles an hour. That's considered fairly elite. That is the best average EV of his entire career, including those amazing seasons he had, including the year when He ended up hitting 31 home runs, so that's pretty good. You also have a hard hit rate of 50.8%. That is the second highest of Jimenez's career. So you put that together and you're like, how did he end up with an 80 WRC plus? Well, Jimenez has always been a guy who hits the ball on the ground too much. Yeah, he hits the ball hard, but hits it into the ground. He had run like 50% ground ball rates. Not really what you want to do as a hitter, but he hit it so hard that they would still be base hits and he still hit enough balls in the air for home runs. This year, Jimenez has taken it to a different level, a 2.7 degree launch angle. That's pretty bad. That's a lot of grounders. A 60% ground ball rate is really, really bad. It is the third highest among players with at least 200 plate appearances this year. The only two guys with higher ground ball rates this season, Harold Ramirez was DFA'd from the Rays because he was bad, and Tim Anderson basically was, before he was DFA'd, the worst hitter in Major League Baseball this year. So that's not great. So the Orioles have to find a way for him to hit the ball a little bit more in the air. And again, he's been good at 50%. It just can't be 60%. That's just like unplayable offensively to have a ground ball rate that bad. But he's hit lefties. He's hitting 304 against left-handed pitching this year. Can't really play the outfield anymore. Wasn't great out there last year. Only played 8 innings in the outfield this year, some due to injuries, some just because he's not great out there. But what's he going to be for the Orioles? Well, kind of a DH, maybe a little first base, maybe a little outfield, but mostly DH option against left-handed pitching. And the Orioles had said they were looking for another right-handed bat. They were kind of short one. Now, you could argue, isn't that Kobe Mayo's spot on the roster? And maybe it will be, but maybe eventually Mayo just takes Arias' spot, and you also have Jimenez as another right-handed hitter. It is certainly a possibility, but I do think not only can he just hit the ball in the air a little bit more, and because he hits the ball so hard and doesn't strike out a lot, he can be a lot better. I think he's going to be a lot better as a hitter. The other thing is, he came from a terrible situation in Chicago. Things can only get better if he starts playing for a good team. And the O's basically gave up close to nothing. Trey Mageau is their 37th ranked prospect in the system via Fangraphs. He was a left-handed pitcher who was taken in the 2022 minor league phase of the Rule 5 draft from Pittsburgh. He was recovering from Tommy John surgery, come back this year. 35 innings, does have a 2.08 ERA, but not a lot of strikeouts, a little bit of a walks issue. Fastball, slider, changeup guy, kind of projects, according to Fangraphs, as a reliever, but someone who wasn't really going to factor in to the Orioles bullpen here in 2024. So they don't give up much, and they get Eloy Jiménez, who could be a factor for this lineup down the stretch, like the move as kind of addition on the margins. But then they made another kind of weird move on the margins, and that was the Orioles acquired outfielder Austin Slater and infielder Eloy Soto from the Cincinnati Reds for either cash or a player to be named later. That full return will be to be named later. Now, kind of a weird move because, okay, Austin Slater makes sense if you don't have Eloy Jiménez. Slater can play the outfield. He's actually been fairly okay defensively out there. Has played all 3 outfield positions, at least 50 innings between his time with the Giants and the Reds this year, and has even played some center field, which is what the Orioles really need, a right-handed hitting center fielder on this roster. And he has a career 122 WRC plus against left-handed pitching, always been a lefty masher, has good hard hit rates the last couple of seasons. So as a guy who in a vacuum would have made sense, but the Orioles had just 10 minutes prior picked up Eloy Jiménez and filled that role. So then you have Austin Slater, and that kind of doesn't make any sense. Now, with the Giants this year, he had kind of fallen off offensively. 78 WRC plus and 112 plate appearances, was DFA'd, sent to the Reds. He had 21 plate appearances with the Reds. He had only 2 hits. They were both singles. The Reds basically got rid of him as well. And you can essentially look at this as like a waiver claim pickup. That is the same thing with Eloy Soto, an infielder who has spent a little bit of time in the big leagues over the past 3 years, but mostly in AAA. Soto was actually with the Orioles organization and in spring training with the O's at one point this year, then was DFA'd. They brought him back. Soto has options, so he has immediately been optioned to AAA Norfolk. He'll be like infield and shortstop depth for the O's at AAA, and you hope they don't need him at MLB, but just another infielder to have down there as they traded away some prospects. For Slater, I don't know, because Slater is a rental. He's a free agent after this year, but he's out of options. You can't just send him to AAA. So he's now on the 40-man roster, but it doesn't really make sense to have him and Jimenez. So I don't really know what they're going to do with Slater. He's like the one guy from this group where I'm just like, I got no idea. They might just DFA him immediately again, try to pass him through waivers and keep him in the organization. That's one thing they could do. I don't really know about that one, but maybe the O's got him before they got Jimenez and it was just reported in the wrong direction and they didn't think they could get Jimenez and then they got him. That's one thing that maybe could have happened. And then they'll just DFA Slater. That's kind of my prediction, but yeah, a little bit of a weird move. They did have to clear 40-man space for both of these guys. So Matt Crook, the left-handed reliever, was DFA. Did make one appearance with the Orioles. Nasty stuff from the left side, but too many walks, just kind of never put it together. And then Jorge Mateo was moved to the 60-day injured list, so he does not count currently towards the 40-man roster. That certainly is not good for his outlook with that elbow injury. That means he's going to be out for a more extended amount of time, and I wouldn't put it past him that Mateo might be done for the year with that gruesome-looking injury, but that did clear up space on the 40-man for the Orioles. And then that last really big-time big league move that the Orioles made was they got more bullpen help, and they went right back to the Phillies. So the O's acquired 2 starters this year. Both came from rebuilding teams, or at least teams that were sellers at the deadline, the Rays and the Marlins. And then they got 2 relievers. And those 2 relievers came from the team that is arguably the best team in Major League Baseball, the Philadelphia Phillies, who are trying to win a World Series. They got Sir Anthony Dominguez from them. And now they get Gregory Soto. Left-handed pitcher Gregory Soto comes to the Orioles in exchange for 2 right-handed pitching prospects, Seth Johnson and Moises Chase. Now, who is Gregory Soto, first of all? He is a 29-year-old left-handed pitcher who has been in the big league since 2019 with the Tigers and was an all-star out of the Tigers bullpen in 2021 and 22 as their closer, then was dealt to the Phillies that offseason, has been in Philly for 2 years. He was okay last year, threw in 69 games, had a 4.62 ERA. Underlying stats were much better, but he kind of faded down the stretch, and the Phillies barely used him in the postseason last year, was not kind of in the bullpen circle of trust, but he had a roster spot again this year, 43 games, 35 and a third innings for the Phillies this year, 4.08 ERA with a 3.61 FIP. Now, his 27% strikeout rate has actually gone up, some of the best one since his all-star days with Detroit, but also has a 12% walk rate, which is still the second lowest of his career, but is much higher than he had last year. The strikeouts and walks look more like they did when he was an all-star in Detroit, and so do the ground ball rates. 50% ground ball rate. That is really, really good from Gregory Soto, and that's because he is a big-time sinker guy. It's 41% sinkers. He throws it 97 to 98, but that sinker's been hit this year, 314 batting average against it. Still gets some ground balls, but there are a lot of hard hit ground balls. He's got a really good slider, though. Throws it 39% of the time, has a 48% swing and miss rate, and opponents are hitting just 194 against that slider from Gregory Soto. It's been an elite pitch this season. And, the overall ERA doesn't look great for Soto, but he's had some bad luck this year and last year. And, he throws really hard from the left side. Lefties have hit just 204 against him. He's been super tough on left-handed hitters this season. And honestly, he just had a really bad April. He's had a 3.04 ERA since May 1st. He's has a 2.84 ERA since June 1st. And the change he made in that time, he kind of went to the slider as his number one pitch. He threw a little bit less fastballs and went to more sliders. And that pitch has just been so good that he's turned himself into somewhat close to the elite reliever he was at multiple times in Detroit when he was an all-star. And that is a good sign for the Orioles as they bring him in. What will his role be in Baltimore? He's kind of a similar pitcher to Cionel Perez, but he's certainly a lefty upgrade if he pitches well over Keegan Aiken, and that makes the bullpen better. And hopefully the O's do get Danny Coulombe back at some point in September to be another good lefty, but he's also a just in case they don't get Coulombe back. He could be a high leverage lefty if he starts to pitch well. I do like the move, and hey, he also has team control, just like Dominguez, who's controlled through next year. Soto is also not a free agent until after 2025, so you can get him back into this bullpen to help the Orioles next season as well. Now, who do they send away? 2 pitching prospects. The first is Seth Johnson, who came over to the O's in the Trey Mancini trade from the Astros in 2022, was a highly coveted, not from the Astros, from the Rays in 2022, was a highly coveted prospect back then, but the only reason the O's were able to get him for Mancini, he needed Tommy John surgery, and the O's knew that. They got him. They immediately put him under the knife, and he really didn't fully return until this season when he came to Double-A. And it'd been good, 65 innings, 2.63 ERA, much higher FIP, 23% strikeout rate, 13% walk rate, not great. He has been on the 40-man roster since November of 22 because he was Rule 5 eligible, but I don't think he's progressed as much as the O's have wanted this year. I think they would have wanted him to be at least in AAA at this point and kind of knocking on the door for a big league bullpen spot. That has not been the case, and it's hard to hold a guy on the 40-man roster who's in Double-A and not close to helping your big league team. So that's one of the reasons why I think they were looking to potentially deal him. Fangraphs has Johnson as the number 16th ranked prospect in the Orioles system. It's a good fastball, mid-90s, curveball, changeup, cutter. Projects as a reliever. It hurts to lose him. The O's had some eggs in that basket when they traded for him in the Mancini deal, but they did get Chase McDermott as well, and he seems to be a piece of the future. So they move on from Johnson, and they also move on from Moises Chase, who has really popped this year in Aberdeen for the Orioles. Number 24 Orioles prospect at Fangraphs, mid-90s fastball with great ride, slider, and changeup. 52 innings, 3.46 ERA, 34% strikeout rate with a 14% walk rate in Aberdeen this year. He's been great. That one might hurt even more than Johnson, but you got to give up some pitching to get some pitching, and the Orioles do that to get Gregory Soto. So those were the, I guess you could say, bigger moves that netted major league, at least caliber talent for the Orioles, but there was also some more minor moves that I want to get to and a big promotion coming up here on Wednesday. Get to that to finish off the pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Supply House. Get supplies from the site that's made for the skilled trade, supplyhouse.com. Supplyhouse.com is the reliable way to order plumbing, h-vac, and electrical products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Shop a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands and get your order delivered right to your door with fast shipping from coast to coast. Do you need help with an order? Get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the business and talk to a real person every single time. Pros in the skilled trades can get a competitive edge by joining SupplyHouse.com's free Trade Master program. Every Trade Master gets access to a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the thousands of trade pros already benefiting from their free membership at supplyhouse.com/TM and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at supplyhouse.com. So a few more moves the Orioles made on that crazy deadline day on Tuesday we have to get to. It's not like they made the blockbuster moves. It was just so many smaller moves that they made that we want to talk about. The next one was actually an interesting trade. It was a minor leaguer for minor leaguer swap that the Orioles made with the Pirates. The O's got right-handed pitching prospect Patrick Riley from Pittsburgh and gave up utility man Billy Cook over to the Pirates. I really like prospect for prospect swaps, especially when it's like one AAA guy for one high A guy, which is what this move was. Well, who is Patrick Riley? He's a 22-year-old right-handed pitcher who the Pirates selected in the 5th round of the 2023 draft from Vanderbilt. Fangraphs has Riley as the number 22 ranked prospect in the Pirates system, a 40 future value guy with a mid-90s fastball, a slider, a changeup, and a cutter. That Eric Longenhagen at Fangraphs really, really likes that cutter. Now, they project him at Fangraphs to be a good reliever with a great fastball, but he's put up some good stuff in high A. He's thrown 88 innings. It's a 3.38 ERA, 30% strikeout rate to a 12% walk rate for this pitcher who will slot in as a pretty good pitching prospect for the Orioles as they lost a couple in Seth Johnson and Moises Chase in these trades. But they did have to give up Billy Cook. Billy Cook, a 25-year-old utility man who has been in AAA this year for the Orioles, was a 10th round pick by the O's in 2021 out of Pepperdine. He's a true utility man, has played every position but shortstop and catcher in the minors this year for the O's. And in 300 plate appearances in AAA this year, he's really held his own in his first time in AAA. 279, 372 on base, 45 slugging, 11 homers, a 120 WRC plus. But he is Rule 5 eligible this offseason. Could have been crunched out of the roster, could have been potentially selected in the Rule 5 draft without the Orioles getting anything for him. Really wasn't much of a path for him to get to the big leagues with the O's. So they go ahead and get something for him, and Patrick Riley could be a pretty special pitching prospect if he continues to put together what he's done in a really, really good 2024 minor league season. Now, the O's also made a couple of roster moves. One was an interesting and somewhat sad one on Tuesday. So we know that James McCann had that horrible looking injury on Monday where he got hit in the face by a 95-mile-per-hour fastball, was bleeding from the nose, looked like he broke the nose, looked like it could have been much worse, but somehow stayed in the game and then caught 8 more innings in that one, had the black eye, the crazy shiner in the dugout. Apparently all the tests were fairly clean, but as you can imagine, the Orioles really didn't want to have McCann be available on Tuesday night's game, and that's a risky game to play with no backup catcher. So they had to get a backup catcher here, and that was Blake Hunt, who had been in AAA with the Orioles after he came over from the Mariners in the small Mike Baumann trade earlier this year. And Hunt's a guy who I think the O's might think could be their backup catcher next year. Now, he was hitting well with Seattle's AAA, hit just 149 in Norfolk since the trade, but you had to have another catcher here just in case. Now, we'll see when he goes back down. Basically, it's because McCann's not going to the IL, but was probably out a day or two. Now, the backup catcher is going to start today's game, a day game after a night game, most likely. So it'll be interesting to see if McCann's ready. If he's not, Hunt will start. If McCann is ready, they'll probably send Hunt right back down and fill his roster spot once again. But to get Hunt onto the roster, they had to send someone off the roster, and they also had to send someone off the 40-man because it was full. And the Orioles DFA'd Cole Irvin. It was something that I had discussed briefly earlier this week as a possibility if the Orioles added a lot at the trade deadline, and that is exactly what they did. He was struggling so much lately. They had just added another lefty starter and lefty reliever. It just made it tough to keep Irvin the way he was pitching. You think with the Trevor Rogers addition, Albert Suarez will move to the bullpen, kind of become the long man. You hope you get Coulomb back later. You've added Gregory Soto. It's just tough to keep Irvin. I mean, he was really good early in the year. April 21st to May 30th, he had 3 consecutive scoreless starts, all of 6 or more innings. He was pitching super well. And then he had that game in New York. Remember that crazy blowout win the Orioles had at Yankee Stadium? Well, they scored like 19 runs, but Cole Irvin didn't even finish 5 innings because he pitched so poorly. And that started to stretch from then until now, where he was moved to the bullpen, became the mop-up guy, and has a 9.57 ERA in his last 26 and a third innings since then. That just won't cut it. And even though he's a free agent after 2026, he has all this control. He's got starting pitching experience. The O's will need starters last year. That made it not an easy decision for the O's, but he was just pitching the worst of anyone on the team. The O's made upgrades, so they need to make moves anyway to get those upgrades onto the roster. And it just came to the point where it had to be Irvin, unfortunately. I mean, just shout out to what he did for this team. This clubhouse was kind of leader of all the celebrations the last 2 years. All he did in the community, the amazing work he did with Barks this summer with all the trouble they were going through. I mean, he was on and off in terms of his contributions on the field, but off the field, Irvin was just an amazing addition to this team. We salute him. I have a feeling he will probably get claimed on waivers, not because he's been good, because trust me, the last month or so, he certainly has not been good. The reason why I say that, though, is because he can eat innings for a bad team, and I have a feeling he's pretty cheap. I think a rebuilding team who just traded away a lot of their pitching will probably, like the Marlins, will probably just grab Cole Irvin and say, hey, pitch 5 or 6 innings every 5 days for us and just get us to the end of this season, be a pretty cheap option. And then you could say, hey, we'll try to fix you in the offseason. We still have 2 years of you once we claim you. So I think that's the case. I hope he does clear waivers and stay in the org, but I don't think it's super likely. At this point, with all of those moves, the Orioles will have to clear a spot for Eloy Jiménez. I mean, maybe Christian Pache's DFA'd. Maybe they would option Heston Kjerstad, although people would not be happy with that move. They'll need to clear one more 40-man spot at least. Most likely the injured reliever Nick Avila is probably the guy who would get DFA. There's a couple other options there, but Avila would be the top one on my list. And then there's one more roster move that was reported by Andy Koska of the Baltimore Banner after Rock Kabako had reported that Jackson Holliday was scratched from the AAA lineup on Tuesday. Yeah, Jackson's coming to Baltimore. Jackson Holliday reportedly will be joining the Orioles on Wednesday for their day game and basically be the replacement for Connor Norby. Now, Terrin Vavra, remember him, had actually been called up Tuesday to replace Norby on the roster, but it's going to be Holliday's spot, and he is going to come back to the big leagues and rejoin this lineup. Now, I'm not sure if he'll play every day, but they're going to get him in spots that are going to at least help him. We know how bad it was the first time, 2 for 34, 18 strikeouts. It certainly did not go well, but I think this second chance is going to be very, very exciting for the Orioles, very exciting for Holliday. He's been great in AAA since being sent back down. I think he kind of got his confidence back, and I am definitely looking forward to seeing Jackson Holliday back in an Oriole uniform. And we will break down that move much, much more on tomorrow's episode, because we'll talk more about it once he is finally here, and we'll try and get some clarity on what exactly all the roster moves will be to get all these new players on the Orioles active roster. And of course, we'll recap the day game between the O's and the Blue Jays, final game of the series. Orioles looking for a series win in that one. They will send their man Grayson Rodriguez to the hill against the Blue Jays, who will send out Paulo Espino, who's been really bad, a veteran right-hander. Yusei Kikuchi was supposed to start. He was traded on deadline day. So yeah, it's going to be Espino, 12:35 start, hopefully early game, and hopefully the Orioles can jump all over Espino. But I'll have the recap of it and all this other trade news, all the holiday news coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I am Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.